Hi, we move into 2 Samuel 19 and 20 today as we look into the last chapters of the reign of David after Absalom's rebellion, as he consolidates his reign, sets up who's in charge, and puts down the final rebellions and deals with betrayers, as we'll see later in beginning of 1 Kings that are delayed for now. So I'm not doing an introductory video for these two chapters because I think they're fairly straightforward, but as I start this video on just these first verses, the little chiasm you can see on the right side of the screen framing David's grieving, just to note briefly what's going on in these couple of chapters and how different they are from each other while they're accomplishing similar purposes, which is by the end to have David fully reinstalled as king and have everybody, we'll see, on his side or not. So in chapter 19, as you can see, one of the key words is king. 64 times in this chapter, and David only 5 times in this chapter. You can see all the way down here. Whereas in chapter 20, as we can see, it's not a key word at all. And we get smaller. And there, it's all about Sheba, son of Bichri, and you can see how many times the final rebellion. But it's a rebellion, as we'll see, that anticipates the division in the monarchy a generation later, after Solomon has reigned and his son Rehoboam has taken over, and we will hear almost the exact same cry we hear here. So it's setting up both the closing of David's reign and the setting up of what follows when Solomon and his son lose the control that David has here. And so another element we'll see in chapter 19 is the emphasis on day and today. So many times day. This is a key day, and the day turns on whether David will give up mourning Absalom and return to being king, or whether he will shame the troops, as Joab calls him out to do, as we'll see. And the story is taking place over here on the other side of the Jordan. In the last chapter, as we were looking through the end of the Absalom rebellion, I noted that David was at the gate of the city, and the city wasn't named. But as far as we can tell, he's not gone back to Jerusalem. And in fact, we'll see later in this chapter that one of the questions is who will accompany him as he goes down to the Jordan, and not only returns to Jerusalem, but replicates the whole journey across the Jordan that Joshua undertook after the Exodus story, beginning the process of reestablishing his reign there in Jerusalem. So we're located down here, and we'll see how that leads us all the way back to Jerusalem eventually. So in our immediate chapter here, as I zoom in, you can see there's a nice tight little chiasm here, and as Falkelman and others point out, they don't note the chiasm as I'm doing, but they do note that at least in terms of the chronological sequence, these verses are out of order. In other words, that David's crying, "Oh my son," has to take place before the people steal into the city, although it doesn't have to be. That's at least Falkelman's view. And whether that's out of order for other stylistic reasons, it certainly creates this nice tight chiasm where we hear David crying out. And many scholars see that as, oh, David has such care for his son. And yet we have to recognize, as I've been arguing all the way back to chapter 13, that there's a good case to be made that David has allowed all this to happen. Whether he's allowed it to happen because he is feigning love for Absalom, or even though he might have real concern for Absalom, but understand he is under orders from his Egyptian overlords to have Solomon be the king. Why do the Egyptians want Solomon over Absalom? Well, we'll have to delay that till later. And of course, we can't know directly because we don't hear from the Egyptians. We can only infer from the differences between what we know of the character of Absalom here and his relationship with David in Jerusalem, and the character of Solomon in relation to David, as well as in relation, as we'll see, to Adonijah and the division of David's court around the succession, much like the succession of Logan Roy in the popular TV show. And we'll be coming to that very soon. So this is a poignant scene here, because as we'll see, it's told Joab, the king is weeping and the victory is turned into mourning. So Joab will have the responsibility of waking the king up. And whether that means that the king will turn on Joab, it raises the question that many scholars have noted, Bodner and others along the way, that when David has said, "You sons of Zeruiah are too powerful for me," is that a propagandistic attempt to deny his responsibility for the murders of Abner and Asahel and others that they engage in? Or is it in fact that they're too strong for him? That David will try to get rid of Joab, but Joab will kill Amasa, David's anointed substitute, and take over again without David having a word of objection. But in the end, when the story is over, not when these chapters are over, it'll be Joab as well who's dead, and we'll see that eventually. So let's just jump right into our immediate scene here, and there are, as always, a number of translation issues to look at. And the first verse up there, "The king is deeply moved," is plainly the verse from the end of chapter 18, and I left that there even though you see the chart as chapter 19 because the original text doesn't know chapters, and the chiasm plainly goes from 1833 to 19:4. So that's what we're covering here. So we looked at verse 33 last time, so I won't go back over these words. That the king, actually, we'll go over it just briefly in case you haven't watched that one. The king is shaken here, and that's a key element. That it recalls, ironically, 7:10, which we can look back to, where there'll be no shaking with David and his successors on the throne forever. Be disturbed no more. So that's the promise, and yet right now the king is shaken. And he went up to the chamber over the gate, and again, this is in Menahim, not in Jerusalem, as far as we can tell. Jerusalem isn't mentioned anywhere. This term for the chamber, Aliyah, is only here in Samuel, 20 times in the Masoretic text, and wept. And we've seen David weeping a number of times. David, like many Israelite men, is not a modern toxic masculine male in the sense of he's afraid to cry. He's got plenty of what we might call toxic masculinity in his war making, but many people see that as honorable. So you can decide yourself whether war making is within the religion you understand in the Bible as what Yahweh intends, or whether this is, as I presented, the religion of empire. But either way, David does not hesitate to weep. So he weeps as he went, and he said in this plaintive cry, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Now, we can't get psychologically into, does David mean that? Does he really wish he had died instead of Absalom? Given all the evidence I've been exploring over the last 7 chapters, that David did nothing and allowed this all to unfold, and then easily put it down by dividing his army among his experienced warriors, and took advantage of Absalom's lack of experience in war, and easily crushed him. And he was caught, of course, with his head in the tree, and died at the hands of Joab. So that's the situation. But now we see what follows up. And it was told Joab, and we really have to raise the question here of how could Joab not know? Where is Joab that he doesn't know exactly what's going on, and who is it that told him? Messengers are very important, but we don't hear who it is here. And as my note below has, the word is a rare hish stem used regularly for indirectly informing someone, as we see in a few other examples. But it's not clear of why Joab seems, as rarely the case, out of the loop. So we see the king is weeping, omitting on the NSV, as the NRSV always does, hine, behold, and framing with verse 10. All the verses in the Hebrew are one verse off here from the Masoretic here, so you can see that down below. That what's verse 1 isn't in the Masoretic text, so this is 19:1 is verse 2, and so we'll be off one verse. So Joab knows the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And Joab could just go, "Oh, well, not my problem," but he makes it his problem, as the narrator goes on to explain exactly what the situation is. So let's look at that here. And my note below has what I was referring to from Fackelman as the suggestion that's not in chronological order. Fackelman suggests the chaotic timeline reinforces the chaotic state of affairs, and that's certainly the case as well, but it also makes a nice chiasm. So the victory that day was turned into mourning. And the term for victory here, teshvuah, we heard earlier for Saul's victories, and then for Jonathan to Saul regarding David there. So there'll be a number of callbacks. Not surprisingly, that David mourning for his son Absalom is parallel to Saul mourning for his son Jonathan. Not that Jonathan was dead, they died together in battle, but that Saul felt that he'd lost Jonathan to Jonathan's love for David over his loyalty to his father. So 2 parallel stories of fathers grieving for their sons, but in very different circumstances. So the victory that day, as my note has, 9 times in 5 verses there and 18 times in the chapter is Yom today, turned into mourning. And there are a couple of different words here. Lavel is the only word, is only here in the Deuteronomistic history. Deuteronomy 34:8, the mourning for Moses. Then we heard it earlier, the mourning for Uriah. We heard it for the wise woman's guys, that mourning over her imaginary sons in the story. And then we see it here. Interestingly, in Genesis 50, in the very end of Genesis, it's 3 times there. And there are a number of parallels between the Joseph story and the David story, as I've been pointing out along the way. As is so often the case, in ORSV provides military terms where the Masoretic text just says people. Both troops and troops here and soldiers is all people. And that's key. This is not a professional army, despite the fact that David has had them for a while. They're simply the people. And that's the emphasis all along. This is not like in my country, the United States of America, where there are people who are professional soldiers and that's what they do. These are just the ordinary people who go into battle when the king calls them in order to save the nation. Or in order to save David, as we've seen. So turn into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. and using a different word here. This is grieving, a different word than we saw for mourning here. So again, this is another callback to the Saul-Jonathan situation, where in 1 Samuel 20, Jonathan was worried that his father would grieve him for siding with David, grieving for his son. And so we see what happens here. The stealing in of the troops recalls 15:6. We can go back to that, where Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And so the hearts of the people of Israel having been stolen, the people steal into the city to not draw David's attention to that. And they're described as embarrassed, as people, not soldiers, who are ashamed when they flee in battle. So that's the sense of mourning, that they thought they won the victory. They got David, his monarchy back, and put down Absalom's rebellion. And now they're feeling like they lost, like they did the wrong thing, as when they flee in battle. 28 times in Samuel. We'll see it again in verse 8 below. And Joab hasn't done anything yet, and the king continues to mourn. As Falkman says, he makes himself inaccessible in both visual and oral terms, covering his face and crying out in a loud voice. So the word for covering here, la'at, is only here in the Masoretic text. Notice the rare words that are in this short little passage. Covering his face, and we see face 6 times in what follows, 3 times in the immediate verses, and you can see it here, faces, faces, and face. Sometimes the New RSV covers those up, but allows us to see them this time. The king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." And although we're going to stop there in this short video to introduce the chapter, note that now Joab has the problem. And we'll look at it closely next time to see how much is Joab risking his own authority and his own life to challenge the king in favor of the people who've risked their lives for him. And we'll have to see how that goes next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.